Massive military strikes. The conflict between Iran, Israel, and the United States dramatically escalated after a series of large-scale military strikes that shocked the international community. For years, tensions between these countries had been building quietly through proxy conflicts, cyber operations, and political threats. However, the situation changed completely when coordinated military actions targeted key Iranian military infrastructure. These strikes reportedly focused on missile bases, military installations, air defense systems, and strategic command centers believed to be involved in regional military operations. The scale and precision of these attacks made them stand out from previous confrontations. Advanced aircraft, long-range missiles, and highly sophisticated surveillance systems were used to identify and hit critical targets. Military analysts noted that the operation appeared carefully planned to weaken Iran's ability to launch large-scale attacks or coordinate regional forces. Within hours, reports began emerging of explosions in multiple locations, with smoke rising from military compounds and defense facilities. These strikes sent an immediate shockwave across the Middle East. Governments across the region quickly raised their security alert levels, while military forces were placed on high readiness in anticipation of possible retaliation. Air defense systems in several countries were activated, and commercial air traffic in certain areas was temporarily disrupted as the situation became increasingly uncertain. For Israel, the strikes were seen as a strategic attempt to limit threats from Iranian missile programs and regional influence. Iranian officials, however, described the attacks as a direct act of aggression and vowed that retaliation would follow. The intense exchange of accusations between governments quickly escalated the political tension, making diplomatic solutions more difficult. As information continued to emerge, international observers and analysts began debating the broader implications of the strikes. Some believed the operation was meant to deliver a powerful warning and demonstrate military superiority, while others warned that such a large-scale attack risked triggering a wider regional conflict. News coverage from around the world focused heavily on the possibility that this confrontation could mark the beginning of a much more dangerous phase of instability in the Middle East. In the hours and days following the strikes, military movements increased across the region. Naval forces repositioned in nearby waters, fighter jets conducted patrols over sensitive areas, and intelligence agencies began closely monitoring potential responses. The rapid sequence of events created an atmosphere of uncertainty and fear, as leaders and civilians alike tried to understand how far the conflict might spread and what consequences could follow if tensions continued to rise. Iran's unprecedented retaliation. Following the large-scale strikes on its military infrastructure, Iran responded with a level of retaliation that many analysts described as unprecedented in the modern history of the region. Within a short period of time after the attacks, Iranian military forces began launching waves of ballistic missiles, cruise missiles, and armed drones toward Israeli territory and locations believed to host American military forces in the Middle East. The response was rapid and highly coordinated, signaling that Iran had prepared contingency plans for such a scenario long before the strikes occurred. Air raid sirens began sounding across multiple Israeli cities as missile defense systems were activated to intercept incoming projectiles. Advanced air defense networks, including layered interception systems, worked continuously to track and destroy many of the missiles before they could reach populated areas. At the same time, Iranian drones were reportedly sent towards strategic targets, forcing defense forces to divide their attention between fast-moving missiles and slower but harder-to-detect aerial threats. The scale of the retaliation was significant, not only because of the number of weapons used, but also because of the geographic spread of the attacks. Reports suggested that missiles and drones were aimed at several strategic locations simultaneously, including military bases, defense facilities, and infrastructure believed to support Israeli and American operations in the region. This multi-directional approach created a complex defense challenge, requiring rapid coordination between military units and intelligence agencies. Regional military forces quickly moved into emergency response mode. Radar systems across neighboring countries monitored the skies for incoming threats, while airspace restrictions were implemented in several areas as a precaution. Civil defense authorities in Israel urged residents in certain regions to remain near shelters, and emergency services were placed on standby to respond to potential impacts. Iranian officials described the retaliation as a necessary response to what they viewed as direct aggression against their sovereignty. State media emphasized that the attacks were intended to demonstrate Iran's military capabilities and its willingness to respond forcefully to external threats. Military commanders also issued statements suggesting that further actions could follow if additional strikes were carried out against Iranian territory. At the same time, international observers began analyzing the strategic message behind the retaliation. Some experts argued that Iran's response was designed to show that it could strike across long distances and challenge powerful adversaries despite ongoing sanctions and pressure. Others suggested that the scale of the retaliation was meant to shift the balance of psychological power in the conflict by proving that Iran could launch large, coordinated operations under intense pressure. As news of the missile and drone launches spread globally, governments and international organizations closely monitored developments. Military analysts examined satellite imagery, radar data, and official statements in an attempt to understand the full scope of the retaliation. The rapid sequence of launches, interceptions, and defensive actions created a tense atmosphere across the region, with constant updates from military sources and emergency services describing the evolving situation. Regional security crisis. As the confrontation between Iran, Israel, and the United States intensified, the effects of the conflict quickly began spreading beyond the borders of the directly involved countries. What initially appeared to be a bilateral military exchange soon developed into a broader regional security crisis, affecting multiple nations across the Middle East. Governments throughout the region suddenly found themselves facing new security threats, rising military tensions, and the possibility that the conflict could spill over into their own territories. Several countries in the region raised their national security alert levels almost immediately after the first major strikes and retaliatory attacks were reported. Military bases increased their defensive readiness, radar systems were activated to monitor potential missile launches, and fighter aircraft began conducting patrols to secure national airspace. The rapid military mobilization reflected a growing fear that the conflict could expand unpredictably, drawing additional countries into the crisis either directly or indirectly. The situation became even more complex due to the presence of various armed groups and political alliances across the Middle East. Over the years, regional conflicts have created networks of allied forces, militias, and political partners that support different sides. As tensions rose, concerns grew that these groups might join the confrontation, opening additional fronts and making the conflict far more difficult to control. Security experts warned that such developments could transform a focused military clash into a widespread regional struggle. Neighboring countries also face challenges related to their airspace and territorial waters. Missile launches and drone flights across the region increase the risk of accidental violations of national borders. In response, governments began coordinating closely with their military forces to ensure that defensive systems were ready to intercept any potential threats entering their airspace. Some countries also temporarily restricted civilian air travel over sensitive areas as a precautionary measure. Economic and logistical concerns also began to emerge as the crisis developed. Important shipping routes and trade corridors in the Middle East are located near areas where military activity increased significantly. Ports, shipping companies, and international businesses started monitoring the situation carefully, worried that the conflict might disrupt vital transportation routes that connect Asia, Europe, and Africa. Diplomatic tensions also intensified as governments around the world reacted to the growing crisis. International organizations and global leaders began calling for restraint, while diplomatic channels worked to reduce the risk of further escalation. Emergency meetings and consultations between governments took place as leaders attempted to assess the evolving situation and prepare for possible consequences. At the same time, civilians across several countries began feeling the psychological impact of the crisis. News reports of missile launches, military movements, and rising tensions created widespread uncertainty. Communities living near military bases or strategic facilities became particularly concerned about the possibility of further attacks or retaliation. Emergency preparedness measures were discussed in several countries, and public awareness campaigns reminded citizens of safety procedures in case of emergencies. The growing regional security crisis highlighted how interconnected the Middle East has become through political alliances, economic ties, and shared security concerns. Even countries not directly involved in the fighting began preparing for potential consequences as the conflict continued to develop across one of the world's most strategically important regions. Humanitarian impact. As the conflict between Iran, Israel, and the United States intensified, the humanitarian consequences quickly became one of the most alarming aspects of the crisis. While military forces focused on strategic targets and defense operations, civilians across several areas of the Middle East began experiencing the harsh realities of living near an active conflict zone. Communities that were once part of normal daily life suddenly found themselves surrounded by sirens, explosions, and constant uncertainty. One of the immediate impacts of the conflict was the damage to infrastructure in areas affected by missile strikes and military operations. Buildings, roads, and essential services in certain locations suffered destruction or severe disruption. Hospitals and emergency facilities faced increased pressure as injured individuals required urgent medical care, while local authorities struggled to manage the growing number of emergencies. Medical staff, already operating under difficult conditions in many regions, were forced to respond to a sudden surge of patients needing treatment. The disruption of essential services also created serious challenges for ordinary citizens. Electricity, water supply, and transportation networks in some affected areas experienced interruptions due to nearby military activity. In times of conflict, these systems often become vulnerable, and even temporary disruptions can make daily life extremely difficult for local populations. Families were forced to adapt quickly to uncertain conditions, often staying indoors for extended periods while monitoring news and safety announcements. The psychological toll of the conflict has also been significant. Continuous alerts, reports of incoming missiles, and the fear of further escalation have created a climate of anxiety among many residents. In areas where air raid warning systems are active, people have had to remain prepared to seek shelter within minutes. Parents worry about the safety of their children, while elderly residents face additional challenges in responding quickly to emergency situations. Another major humanitarian concern involves the displacement of civilians. When military activity intensifies near populated areas, some residents choose to temporarily relocate to safer regions. Even short-term displacement can place significant strain on communities, particularly when large numbers of people move at the same time. Local governments and humanitarian organizations often work together to provide shelter, food, and basic assistance for those affected by such movements. Schools and educational institutions in certain areas have also been disrupted, as authorities attempt to ensure the safety of students and staff. In times of heightened security risk, classes may be suspended or shifted to alternative arrangements, affecting the normal routines of families and children. This interruption in education can add to the broader social impact of the conflict, especially if instability continues for extended periods. Humanitarian organizations and international agencies closely monitor situations like these to provide assistance where possible. Their work often includes delivering medical supplies, supporting emergency services, and coordinating relief efforts for affected communities. However, operating in areas experiencing active conflict presents serious challenges, as access routes and safety conditions can change rapidly. The humanitarian dimension of the conflict highlights the human cost that often accompanies geopolitical tensions and military confrontations. Behind the strategic decisions and military movements are millions of civilians whose daily lives are directly affected by the instability created by such conflicts. Global economic risk. As tensions between Iran, Israel, and the United States escalated, economists and global financial analysts began closely watching the potential economic consequences of the conflict. The Middle East plays a crucial role in the global economy, particularly in energy production, trade routes, and international markets. When instability increases in this region, the ripple effects are often felt far beyond the countries directly involved in the fighting. One of the most significant concerns revolves around the global oil supply. The Middle East is home to some of the largest oil-producing countries in the world, and many of these nations rely on shared shipping routes to transport energy resources to international markets. A key location in this network is the Strait of Hormuz, a narrow but extremely important passage connecting the Persian Gulf to the global ocean trade system. A large percentage of the world's oil shipments pass through this route every day, making it one of the most strategically sensitive areas on the planet. When military tensions rise near this critical waterway, shipping companies and energy markets immediately begin to react. Even the possibility of disruptions can cause oil prices to increase due to fears of reduced supply. Traders in global energy markets often respond quickly to political and military developments in the region, which can lead to rapid price fluctuations. Higher energy prices can then affect transportation costs, manufacturing expenses, and overall economic stability in many countries. Beyond oil markets, international trade routes are another area of concern. The Middle East connects major shipping paths between Asia, Europe, and Africa, making it a central hub for global commerce. If military activity spreads near important maritime corridors, commercial vessels may be forced to reroute or delay shipments. Such disruptions can slow the movement of goods, increase transportation costs, and create delays in global supply chains that businesses depend on. Financial markets also tend to respond strongly during periods of geopolitical instability. Investors often react to uncertainty by shifting their assets into what they consider safer investments, such as gold or stable currencies. Stock markets in different regions may experience sudden volatility as companies that rely on global trade, energy supplies, or regional stability face new risks. Another economic concern involves the impact on regional economies within the Middle East itself. Countries in the region rely heavily on stable trade relationships, tourism, and international investment. When conflict escalates, travel warnings, security concerns, and investor uncertainty can reduce economic activity. Businesses may postpone major projects, while foreign companies reconsider expansion plans until the situation becomes more predictable. Energy importing countries around the world also closely monitor developments in the Middle East, because rising fuel prices can influence inflation, transportation costs, and household expenses. Governments in many nations begin preparing contingency plans when conflicts threaten energy stability, including strategic oil reserves and alternative supply arrangements. The global economic risk associated with conflicts in the Middle East demonstrates how interconnected modern economies have become. Events taking place in one region can quickly influence markets, industries, and consumers across the world, as financial systems react to uncertainty and potential disruptions in critical resources and trade networks. Risk of wider war. One of the most serious concerns surrounding the conflict between Iran, Israel, and the United States is the possibility that it could expand beyond a limited military confrontation and develop into a much wider war. The Middle East is a region with a complex network of alliances, rivalries, and strategic interests, and conflicts involving major powers often carry the risk of drawing in additional countries or armed groups. Over the years, many regional actors have developed political, military, and ideological connections with one another. These relationships mean that when tensions escalate between major powers, other groups may feel pressure to take sides or become involved. Military analysts often describe this as a chain reaction effect, where a conflict between a few countries can gradually spread across multiple fronts as alliances activate and regional partners respond. Another factor that increases the risk of a wider war is the presence of numerous military bases, naval forces, and air defense systems across the Middle East. Several global powers maintain military assets in the region to protect their strategic interests, shipping routes, and regional partnerships. When conflict erupts, these forces may become targets or participants, which increases the possibility of accidental encounters or unintended escalation. The geographical layout of the Middle East also contributes to the risk of expansion. Many countries share close borders, strategic waterways, and interconnected security environments. If military operations cross into neighboring territories, or if missiles and drones travel across multiple airspaces, other governments may feel compelled to respond in order to protect their sovereignty and national security. Diplomatic relations can also become strained during such crises. Governments around the world may issue statements supporting one side or calling for restraint, but political disagreements sometimes deepen during times of conflict. Emergency meetings between international organizations and world leaders often take place in an attempt to prevent escalation, yet the effectiveness of these diplomatic efforts depends heavily on the willingness of all parties to pursue negotiation instead of further confrontation. The possibility of cyber operations and unconventional warfare also adds another layer of complexity to modern conflicts. In addition to traditional military actions, nations may attempt to disrupt communications, financial systems, or infrastructure through digital attacks. These actions can extend the impact of the conflict far beyond the physical battlefield, affecting countries that may not be directly involved in military operations. Public opinion and political pressure within each country can also influence the direction of a conflict. When tensions rise and casualties occur, leaders may face internal pressure to respond forcefully or defend national interests. This can make de-escalation more difficult, especially when governments are attempting to balance domestic expectations with international diplomatic efforts. As military movements increase and strategic decisions continue to unfold, the risk of a wider war remains one of the most closely watched aspects of the situation. Security experts, diplomats, and international observers constantly analyze developments in the region, looking for signs that the conflict could expand further and affect additional countries or strategic regions around the world.